Her pregnancy brought shame, so her mother traded the obese girl to a giant cowboy for a cow. Dustwater crossing Wyoming territory. Autumn of 1887. The wind was sharp that morning, dry and unforgiving like the rest of the land. Dustwater Crossing was little more than a scattering of buildings and a livestock yard where dreams came to die or get sold by the pound. The sun had barely risen when Edna Whitmore dragged her daughter across the cracked earth, one hand gripping Leia's arm as if she might run. Leia Whitmore, 20 years old and 7 months pregnant, waddled beside her mother in a faded cotton dress, too tight around her belly and thighs. Her cheeks were flushed from the chill and the shame. She kept her head down. She always did. You keep your eyes straight, Leia. Edna snapped. You got nothing to look proud about. The market was already stirring. Ranchers shouted over cattle, pigs squealed, and traders hawked everything from ropes to rusted nails. But what drew eyes that morning wasn't livestock. It was the sight of a round, bellied girl being pulled through the gates like she was up for auction. A few whispers broke out. That Whitmore girl, the fat one, knocked up. Her mame's fixing to get rid of her. Cullen Rainier stood alone by the far fence. One boot braced on the lower rail, arms crossed over his massive chest. He was a mountain of a man, well over 6 FD, thick through the shoulders, his face shaded by a wide, brimmed hat. He didn't blink as Edna approached. You Cullen Rainier? Edna asked, not bothering with niceties. He gave a single nod. You said you'd take her. He looked past Edna to Leia, whose eyes stayed locked on the dirt. He didn't say anything. Edna let out a bitter laugh. Hell, you'll get the better end of the deal. She eats more than a hog and whines more than a broken gate. But you'll get your cow. Behind them, a ranch hand led forward a glossy black milk cow, tethered and quiet. Cullen gave it a brief glance, then turned his gaze back to the girl. She got a name, he asked, voice low and deep as canyon shadow. La, Edna said. Leia Whitmore, 20 years old, stupid as stone and carrying a bastard. No need to dress it up. You want her, take her, you don't. I'll dump her by the creek and let the buzzards sort it out. La's knees shook. You got anything to say, girl? Edna barked. Leia opened her mouth, but no words came. Just air and fear. She does not cook. She barely cleans. She cries at night like a child and smells like potatoes half the time. But if you want a womb to warm your empty shack, she'll do. Cullen stepped forward. For a heartbeat, Leia thought he might speak to her. Instead, he untied the cow's lead rope and handed it to a boy nearby. She'll ride with me, he said. That's it. Edna blinked. You got your cow. The rest is none of your concern. And well, Edna gave a cruel smirk. Well, hell, at least now she's worth something. First time in her life. She turned on her heel without a glance back. Leia stood frozen, the cold biting her through thin shoes. All around her, people stared, some with curiosity, others with disgust, a few with pity, but none did anything. Not one stepped forward. She is yours now, Cowboy. Someone called, laughing. Cullen said nothing. He simply nodded toward his wagon. Leia moved slowly, heart hammering, stomach twisting. Her hands cradled her belly as if to shield the child from all of it. As she climbed onto the wagon bench beside the giant man, she whispered barely loud enough to hear, I am not a thing. Cullen looked ahead, took the reins, and said, Only you ain't, not to me. And they rode off into the dust. The wagon creaked over the uneven prairie, wheels rattling with each rut and root. Leia sat in the back, her hands cradling her swollen belly, the weight of it pressing down like stone. Her dress clung damp with sweat and dust. She did not speak, neither did Cullen. He held the reins with hands as large as shovels, shoulders broad beneath a faded coat. his face expressionless. The silence stretched long between them, not tense, just empty, like he had nothing to say and no intention of filling the air with words that were not needed. By the time the sun dipped low, painting the sky in rust and violet, they turned off the main path and followed a narrow trail through low hills. Scrub pines dotted the landscape. A hawk circled once overhead, then vanished behind the ridge. Leia squinted as a cabin came into view. It wasn't large, but it stood firm. Logs fitted tight, roof patched well, chimney breathing faint smoke. Alinto sat beside it, sheltering a wood pile and a half-built cradle. The fence line was straight, the gate still hung even. Cullen pulled the wagon to a stop. "You can come in," he said simply, climbing down. Leia hesitated. Her feet hit the ground with more force than grace. Her back etched from the ride. Every part of her felt swollen, sore, and foreign. She followed him toward the cabin. Inside, the place smelled of cedar and earth. It was simple, one room but clean. A table with 2 chairs, a small bookshelf, a coat hook by the door. The bed, though plain, looked sturdy. The blanket folded square across the footboard. A couch sat near the window, worn but padded. "You can rest there," Cullen said, pointing to it. Leia looked at him unsure. "Where will you sleep?" "I'll figure it out," he replied, already turning away. She sat slowly, the cushion groaning beneath her weight. She kept her hands folded over her stomach, shoulders tight, afraid to touch anything, to take up more space than she already did. Cullen moved around the room with quiet purpose. He poured a glass of water and set it on the table beside her. Then, without another word, he grabbed a lantern and stepped outside, the door closing soft behind him. Leia did not sleep much that night. The couch was narrow, the blanket scratchy, but the silence was what unsettled her most. No slamming doors, no sharp words, no footsteps stomping just to remind her she was not wanted. She laid still for hours, listening to crickets, to the crackle of dying firewood, to the sound of her own heartbeat. Morning came slow and pale through the window. She blinked against the light. At first, she thought she had dreamed it, the smell of cooked food. Her stomach growled loud and sudden. She sat up carefully. On the table sat a plate of biscuits, still steaming eggs, a slice of bacon. Next to it, a tin cup of milk and a folded napkin. Cullen stood outside splitting firewood. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, arms flexing with each swing. He did not look in her direction, he just worked steady and strong. Leia stared at the food, her fingers twitched on her lap. No one had ever made her breakfast, not without a demand, not without a threat or a side comment about her size. She had always served others silently, shamefully. She stood slowly, waddled to the table, and Saturday. For a moment, she just looked at the plate. Then quietly, tears slipped down her cheeks, not sobbing, just the quiet ache of surprise and confusion. She took a bite. The biscuit was buttery, warm, and real. From the porch, Cullen's axe struck wood again. Through the open window, she whispered, not sure if he could hear her, "Thank you." There was no reply, but she thought she saw him pause just for a second before lifting the axe once more. The days passed in soft silence. Leia didn't know what to expect, but it wasn't this. The sound of Cullen's boots on the porch each morning, the smell of firewood and coffee, the absence of cruelty. He did not speak much, but his presence filled the space like something steady, unshifting, but never imposing. One afternoon, she heard the creak again. That stubborn groan of the front door she had winced at every time it opened. Cullen stood over it now with a wrench and oil, brow furrowed as he worked the hinges. "That sound's been driving me crazy." He muttered more to the door than to her. She said nothing, just watched as the noise vanished with each slow turn of his wrist. The next day, the chair near the window. the one she always sat in to rest her aching legs, had a folded quilt laid over the seat. Beneath it, an extra cushion. She sank into it with a surprised sigh, her swollen ankles grateful for the softness. He never mentioned the change, and yet every small thing he did seemed to say, "I see you." Not in the way others had, through narrowed eyes and sneers, picking apart her body like something to ridicule. Cullen never once looked at her the way they had. His gaze did not linger or judge. He glanced only when needed, always meeting her eyes instead of her curves. He never asked about the baby, never pressed about who the father was or why she had been traded like livestock. Instead, he offered space, and in that space, slowly something inside her began to breathe. One evening, as Cullen sanded down the frame of the baby's cradle, Leah found herself speaking. "My daddy died when I was 8, she said quietly. Cullen paused, not looking up, just listening. He was gentle. He used to sing while mending fences. Said work goes faster when the heart's warm. Cullen nodded slightly, running the grain of the wood with slow strokes. When he passed, Mame changed. She said I looked too much like him, called me soft, lazy, said no man would ever want a girl like me." The words hung heavy in the air, but Cullen didn't feel the silence. He simply kept sanding, patient and present. Leah looked out the window, blinking fast. "I used to sleep in the barn sometimes, just so I didn't have to hear her call me names." She chuckled bitterly. Cold out there in winter, but quieter. Cullen stood and stretched, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight. He didn't offer pity, just placed the finished rail of the cradle down gently beside her. That night she ate her supper without shame. Her fork did not tremble, and she dared to ask for a second helping. The next morning, Leah watched him repair the back gate. A breeze caught her dress as she stood nearby, and for a moment fear sparked in her. Fear of being seen, judged, mocked. But Cullen only glanced at her and said, "Wind's picking up." Not a word about her form. Not a look that stung, just the weather. Later, they sat on the porch, the sun dipping low behind the hills. She shifted in her seat, hands on her belly, eyes fixed on the horizon. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Cullen grunted softly, his way of saying yes. "Why don't you ask what happened?" "Why I ended up like this." He leaned back, arms resting on his thighs. "'Cause it ain't my business unless you want it to be," he said. She studied him, her voice barely a whisper. "Don't you think I'm disgusting?" The wind stilled. Even the grass seemed to hold its breath. Cullen's brow furrowed, not in confusion, but in something closer to pain. "I see a woman," he said quietly. "One who's carried more hurt than anyone ever should, and she's still standing." Leah's throat closed around her breath. Cullen looked out across the land. "You survived things most don't. That don't make you disgusting. That makes you strong." She said nothing for a long while, but inside her something uncurled, something soft and trembling that had been buried for years beneath other people's words. That night she slept, without clutching the blanket. The morning started like most, quiet, steady, with the scent of woods trailing from the chimney and the distant thud of Cullen chopping logs. Leah was hanging herbs dry near the window when she heard hooves on gravel, not Cullen's cart. He was still at the back of the property. She stepped onto the porch, one hand instinctively cupping her belly. A man in a tan duster reined in just past the gate, his horse snorting dust. He had a wide, brimmed hat tipped low, a smirk already tugging at his unshaven face. "Well, I'll be," he drawled, sliding down from saddle. Thought the stories were just smoke till now. Leah stepped back slightly. She didn't know his name, but the way he looked at her like she was a curiosity, not a person, set her nerves on edge. "So it's true," he went on, laughing low. "The giant took in the fatso. What's it like out here, sweetheart? He feeding you slop or scraps?" She said nothing. The man's eyes swept her frame. "Look at You, that belly is about to split. You're like a walking birth sack, ain't you? Her breath caught behind her. The cabin door opened. Cullen emerged slowly, wiping his hands on a cloth, jaw tight. Unreadable. The man tipped his hat mockingly. Cullen Rayner. Never thought you'd turn rancher and nursemaid. What's next? Diapers and lullabibis. Cullen said nothing. The man laughed louder. Hell. You could have had any number of women in town. Instead, you're out here playing savior to a walking butter churn. Still, Cullen didn't move fast. He walked calm, measured, like a storm gathering. Slow, then he stopped at the fence. Leia watched as his hands gripped the top rail. With one wrenching motion, he tore a thick plank free and slammed it onto the dirt in front of the man's boots. Sound cracked the silence like lightning. The man stepped back, startled. Cullen's voice was low, even. You lost, just saying what everyone else is thinking. Cullen didn't blink. Then say it. Someplace else. The man squinted, his smile turning mean. You going to hit me with that stick, Rayner? Cullen didn't raise the board again. Instead, he reached out slowly and placed one hand gently on Leia's shoulder, steadying her from behind. His eyes never left the intruder. No one touches what I care for, he said, not with hands, not with words. Leia felt the warmth of his hand through the fabric of her dress, not possessive, not proud, protective. The man sneered. You picking trash, Rayner, but don't be surprised if folks spit in your face for it. Cullen didn't flinch. He just looked at the man. Something in that gaze, silent, unmoved, was louder than any threat. The man mounted his horse with a huff. Suit yourself, but I wouldn't raise no child out of shame. He turned and kicked up dust on the road, the hoof beat hats fading into the hills. Leia stood frozen. Her body trembled, but not from fear, from something else. She turned slowly toward Cullen. You didn't have to say all that. He looked down at her. Yeah, he said softly, I did. She swallowed. No one's ever, then let this be the first. He interrupted. His voice wasn't loud, but it rang like a bell. For the first time in her life, someone hadn't just stood next to her. They had stood for her. Leia looked down at the splintered plank lying in the dust. It wasn't a weapon. It was a warning, not to the world but to herself. She wasn't alone anymore. The days softened. There were still silences, but they no longer pressed on her like a weight. Instead, they wrapped around her like a quilt, worn and familiar. They became a space where things grew quietly, trust maybe, or something close to it. They were the breath between words that mattered, a pause where neither of them had to explain why. They stayed. Cullen never asked for help, but Leia noticed the way his hand slowed when she drew near, the way he handed her tools instead of doing it all himself. It wasn't just kindness. It was something gentler than that, a subtle invitation to belong. It started with herbs. These are yarrow, he said one morning, crouched low beside the shed, where sunlight dappled the soil. His voice was low, even patient. Boil them for fevers, dry the leaves for cuts. He broke off a sprig and handed it to her, sap already staining his fingers. She knelt slowly, letting the earth press into her knees. The leaves were rough, their smell bitter. She stripped the stems as he showed her, then bundled the stalks tight with twine and hung them high in the rafters of the shed, where they dry in the warmth. The work stained her hands. Sap and dust, little green flecks caught under her nails, but she didn't mind. It was the first time in months she'd felt useful, like she wasn't just waiting to give birth, like she was living now. Next came the sunflower seeds. Split these, Cullen said the following day, pouring a mound of striped shells into a weathered wooden bowl. Chickens like them. Small helps them digest better. Sums. Leia carried the bowl to the porch, lowered herself into the chair he'd fixed with extra cushions, and got to work. Her fingers found a rhythm, crack, flick, drop. The seeds clicked against the wood like tiny heartbeats. It was a small task, repetitive, almost mindless, but it grounded her, centered her. When she was done, Cullen reappeared with a small tin pail and offered it without a word. Let's feed him. They walked to the chicken coop together. She waddled slow and wide, hipped. He matched her pace without comment. The chickens darted toward them in a flurry of yellow and white, pecking at her skirts, brushing against her ankles. Leia laughed, high and sudden, like a bell that hadn't rung in years. The sound startled even her. Cullen turned slightly. "You got a gentle voice," he said, watching the birds settle near her feet. She blinked. "No one's ever said that to me." That evening, she found something waiting for her on the porch. A rocking chair, hand-carved fresh cedar, its surface still warm from the Sunday. Its back curved gently, its legs strong and balanced. She ran her hand along the armrest. "You made this." Cullen gave a one-shouldered shrug. "Figured you might want a place to sit while you watch the sky." She did just that as the sun fell behind the hills, painting the grass in amber. The wind picked up as dusk settled in, and before she could reach for her old shawl, Cullen stepped outside and handed her a folded bundle, a new one, knitted, rough in places with loops slightly uneven, but undeniably handmade, soft green wool, threaded with browns and pale creams like earth after rain. Leia clutched it to her chest. "You didn't have to." "I know," Cullen said. Then he turned and walked back inside. That night, sleep refused to come, not because of pain, but because something inside her stirred, something she couldn't name, like warmth where frost had lived too long. Under the glow of the oil lamp, Leia sat at the table, shawl over her shoulders, needle in hand. She hadn't sewn since her mother sneered that she ruined every stitch she touched. But tonight, her fingers moved, steady and sure. By morning, she had a gift, a square of cotton, plain, uneven, imperfect, but stitched with care. On the corner, one letter C. She folded it and placed it beside Cullen's bedding on the floor. No note, no explanation. At dawn, she rose to find him already outside splitting wood. And there, wrapped around his thick wrist, was the handkerchief, tied like it mattered. Leia didn't cry. She didn't sob or hide her face. She just stood there at the window, letting the tears fall freely, quietly, not out of sorrow, but because for the first time in her life, she had offered something of herself and it had been accepted. No ridicule, no mockery, just dignity, just care. She wasn't a burden anymore. She was becoming part of something real. The wind shifted. It came sharper that morning, carrying not the scent of dust or wild flowers, but trouble. Cullen noticed first a flicker on the horizon. A wagon drawn by two dark mays, followed by a smaller rider on horseback. One wore a long black coat and a collar high at the neck, the town preacher. The other rode stiffly, a rifle slung behind his back, the sheriff, and between them, perched upright in wagon seat, was a woman with gray stray hair coiled like a noose. Edna Whitmore. Leia saw the dust cloud from the porch. Her hands froze over the laundry basin. The fabric clung to her knuckles, soap suds dripping like sweat. "No," she whispered. Cullen stepped up beside her. Inside, she obeyed, heart pounding, the swell of her belly suddenly feeling 10 times heavier. By the time the visitors dismounted, Cullen had already latched the barn doors, drawn the curtains, and pulled the long rifle from the top shelf of the wardrobe. He sat it down, not pointed, not raised, just ready. A knock came, sharp, impatient. Cullen opened the door halfway. He stood like a wall in the frame, voice low. "Morning." The sheriff spoke first. "Got a bit of a dispute." Edna stepped forward, skirts stiff and dustless despite the journey. Her eyes scanned the cabin's interior with disdain. "My daughter," she said like the words tasted bad. "I'm here to take her back." Cullen's brows didn't lift. "You traded her." Edna's lips curled. "I bartered temporary custody, not ownership. She's blood. She belongs home. She belongs where she's safe." The preacher cleared his throat. The matter might require town arbitration, a woman in her condition living alone with an unmarried man. Cullen's voice cut clean. "What does Leia want?" They all paused. Edna blinked. "She's not in a state to know what she wants." Cullen turned without another word and stepped aside. Inside, Leia had been listening. She pressed a hand to her chest, the other resting protectively on her belly. When he looked at her, she knew it was her choice, not his, not Edna's. Hers. She stepped forward slowly, every movement trembling but deliberate. Her dress was plain, her hair loose in soft waves, her chin for once held high. "Mama," she said evenly. Edna's eyes narrowed. "Don't mama me, girl. You're coming home." La took a breath. "You sold me." Edna scoffed. "Don't be dramatic. I made a deal. You were eating us out of house and hope. You embarrassed the family. You left me no choice. No choice." Illa's voice broke, but she didn't stop. "You could have helped me, protected me, asked me who the father was, but you didn't even want to know." Edna's gaze darted toward the preacher. "I did what I had to." "You sold me for a cow," Leah said. The words cracked across the yard like a whip. "I may be fat. I may be pregnant, but at least now," she said, voice rising, "someone sees me as a person, not burden, not a price." Cullen stood quietly behind her, unmoving. The preacher shifted uncomfortably. The sheriff looked down, but Edna, her mouth opened and shut once. She took one step back, then another. Her face flamed red, not with shame, but with something colder. "You'll regret this," she hissed. "That child," Leah interrupted, eyes burning. "That child will grow up knowing they were wanted. Not traded, not silenced, not broken." Edna turned, skirts snapping in the wind. She didn't say goodbye, didn't glance back, just climbed into the wagon and snapped the reins. Dust rose behind her wheels. The preacher gave a half-hearted nod and followed. The sheriff looked once at Cullen, then at Leah. He nodded once, respectful, and turned his horse without a word. When the sound of hooves faded into the hills, Leah leaned against the doorframe. Her breath shook. Cullen stepped beside her. "You did that," he said softly. She closed her eyes. "I finally said it." She whispered out loud. "You can say it again." He offered. "I'm not property." She murmured. "I'm not shame. I'm not a mistake." Cullen didn't answer. He just stood beside her. And for the first time, Leah felt something shift deep inside her. Not fear, not grief, but power. The rain came hard that night. It beat against the windows like fists, wind howling through the eaves, lightning cracking over the hills. Inside the barn, warmth flickered from a lantern. The horses were quiet, sensing the shift. The air smelled of hay, wet wood, and coming change. Leah gripped the edge of the blanket beneath her. Her breath hitched. The pain had started just after dusk, low and steady. Now it came in waves. Sharp and deep, ripping through her like thunder. "I think it's time," she whispered, tears already lining her lashes. Cullen was beside her in a breath. He had already brought water, already laid down clean cloth, already lit the fire higher in the hearth and locked the doors from the inside. "You're safe," he murmured, kneeling beside her. "We'll do this together." She nodded, biting her lip through the next contraction. The storm outside raged, but in the barn there was only the sound of her breathing, the rustle of blankets, the steady scrape of Cullen's boots as he moved, bringing towels, holding her hand, soaking cloth to press against her forehead. "I can't," she whimpered once, when the pain flared sharp and cruel. "You can," he said softly, leaning closer. "You already have." His hand was huge but gentle against her back, anchoring her as she cried out, "Breathe, Leah." "Just breathe through it," she screamed then, loud, raw, a sound from some place deeper than bone. Sweat poured down her face, her whole body shook. "You're doing it." Cullen whispered, almost there. The next push tore her, but after it, silence. Then a cry, wild and furious and alive. Leah sobbed before she even saw her. Cullen leaned back, cradling a tiny bundle slick with life. His face was unreadable, but his hands shook just slightly. He wrapped the baby gently, checked her, and then looked at Leah. "She's here," he said, voice. Then, slowly, reverently, he placed the baby in Leah's arms. She looked down. Red skin, closed eyes, a mouth opened wide in protest, fingers clenched, tiny and perfect. Leah gasped, half laugh, half sob. "She's beautiful," she whispered. Cullen crouched beside her, one knee in the hay, watching mother and child as if afraid to break the moment. He didn't reach out. He just looked and said, "This little girl, she's proof." Leah blinked at him, still crying. "Proof," she asked, "that you lived," he said, "that you fought." He reached for a towel and gently wiped her temple. "She's the reason they don't get to write your story anymore." Leah clutched her daughter closer. In her arms wasn't just a child. It was everything she had survived for. Outside, the storm broke into quiet drizzle. Inside, new life breathed for the first time, and Leah, torn, aching, exhausted, had never felt more whole. Rumors like prairie fire always find their way, but this time they didn't carry shame. They carried curiosity, then wonder, then quietly respect. It started with whispers in the general store. The blacksmith's wife saw her first, Leah, in a plain dress that hugged her full figure, cheeks flushed with late summer sun, her newborn daughter cradled to her chest. Beside her stood Cullen Rior, a mountain of a man, flannel shirt rolled to the elbow, his gaze following Leah's every step like she was the only thing that ever made sense. No chains, no leash, just something stronger than either, devotion. They bought flour, soap, and seed. They didn't rush, they didn't hide. Leah smiled at the woman behind the counter. Cullen nodded to the boys who used to spit when she passed. No one dared mock her now. Some townsfolk still whispered, "Is it true he took her for a cow? Is it true she gave birth in his barn?" But the way Cullen held the baby against his chest while Leah counted coins, gentle, protective, proud, it softened mouths and quieted laughter. They came to town more after that. Not often, just enough to be seen, to be real. And little by little, Leah Whitmore became a name people didn't say with curled lips. Spring came. The valley behind Cullen's land turned green with soft grasses and bluebells. Wild flowers grew without asking permission. So did love. They didn't plan a wedding. There was no preacher, no crowd, just the three of them, Leah, Cullen, and the baby girl with a cry like a hawk and a grip like hope. They stood under the wide branches of an old oak tree, barefoot in the grass, wind tugging at Leah's skirt. Cullen wore the same shirt he always did. Leah wore the shawl he'd knit her. He held her hands. She held his gaze. And with no one watching but the birds and sky, they whispered vows that didn't need witnesses. "I see you," he said simply. "I believe you," she answered, voice thick. He bent and kissed her, not hard, not fast, but with the kind of reverence a man gives to something once thought lost. Their baby girl cooed in Leah's arms. Afterward, they sat in the shade and ate honey biscuits. No music, no speeches, just the sound of wind and a woman's laughter, unapologetic, full and free. That night, in their small, warm cabin, Leah held her daughter close, her hair damp from the bathwater Cullen had drawn. The fire crackled low. Outside, the stars blinked. Inside, peace bloomed like something earned. Leah kissed her daughter's tiny hand and whispered into the soft darkness. "You weren't born from shame, my love." She paused, voice trembling. "You were born from choice and love, always love." And in that cabin, beneath a roof built by calloused hands, Leah knew she didn't need to be smaller to be worthy. She didn't need to be quiet to be safe. She didn't need permission to be happy. She just needed to be home, and she finally was. If this story moved you, if it made you feel seen or reminded you that love can rise from even the hardest ground, go ahead and tap that like button and subscribe to Wild West Love Stories. We've got more tales of heart, grit, and the kind of romance that defies dust, time, and bloodlines. Because out here, love rides taller than legend, and no soul is ever too broken to be chosen. Stay wild, stay warm. We'll see you in the next story.